ever feel like, you're swimming against the tide, battling to stay afloat?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like constantly struggling just to keep your head above water.
I know that feeling.
You're not alone if you do. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of Alan Watts and his philosophy of just letting go.
Alan Watts. If anyone knew how to ride the waves of life, it was him.
Really is. And what's so captivating about him, at least for me, is that he wasn't just, preaching Eastern philosophy.
Right.
He embodied it,
He did. He had this way, this incredible knack for taking these like ancient wisdom traditions, Zen, Buddhism, Taoism,
Yeah.
and just making them feel so relevant to like our modern lives.
It's true. He wasn't like some stuffy academic, he really wanted people to get this stuff, to actually experience the freedom and the joy that comes from letting go. But I think a good place for us to start is, like, where do we even begin? Because I think it's fair to say we're pretty hardwired to want control.
Yeah, I mean, it's in our nature, right? To try and exert our will from the moment we're born.
Yeah.
It's all about like, making things happen the way we want them to. But as Watts so brilliantly pointed out, that iron grip, it can actually create more problems than it solves.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Okay.
Yeah, and he loved to use the analogy of a river to kind of illustrate this.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this river analogy.
So picture a river.
Okay.
Flowing naturally, right?
Yeah.
Effortlessly.
Yeah.
And now, imagine trying to dam it up.
Yeah.
To force it to go against its nature.
Oh, okay.
What happens?
Chaos.
Chaos, flooding, you get it. And Watts believed it's the same with our lives.
Yeah.
The more we try to control every little thing, the more we disrupt that natural flow. And we create all this unnecessary stress, resistance.
So then what's the alternative? Are we just supposed to surrender to the chaos and just let life toss us around like driftwood?
Not quite. It's more about finding a way to move with the current rather than against it.
Okay.
Think of a surfer riding a wave. There's a skill to that, right? An art to navigating these really powerful forces. And that's where this idea of wu-wei comes in.
Okay.
It's a Taoist principle that Watts talked about a lot.
Okay.
Often translated as non-doing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about, like, being passive.
Okay, so when I hear non-doing, I kind of think giving up. But I get what you're saying, that there's got to be more to it.
There is. It's more about acting in harmony with the natural order of things.
Okay.
Rather than constantly trying to impose our will. Watts had this great line. He said, to have faith is to trust yourself to the water. When you swim, you don't grab hold of the water, because if you do, you will sink and drown.
Wow.
Instead, you relax and float. That's wu-wei in action.
Wow, that's such a powerful image.
It is.
And it makes a lot of sense. But if we're not, like, clinging to control, what are we even left with? Like, how do we navigate the world without that sense of, I don't know, solidity?
That's where things get really, really interesting. Because often what we mistake for solidity is actually just the ego.
Okay.
That sense of ourselves as these separate, independent beings clinging to control.
And this is where all of those, like, Eastern philosophies that Watts was so drawn to, this is where they really come into play, right? Like the idea that the ego, it's all an illusion.
Precisely. Watts drew so heavily from Hinduism, Buddhism. These traditions emphasize that our sense of a separate self, it's a construct.
Okay.
And it's a source of a lot of our suffering.
Really?
Think about it. This illusion of separation, it creates this artificial barrier between us and everything else.
So you're saying that the ego, that sense of me, that's actually what's keeping us feeling stuck, constantly, struggling for control.
In a nutshell, yes. It's the ego that clings to possessions, relationships, even beliefs about ourselves. All in this attempt to maintain this illusion of a separate self. And that clinging, that's where the fear of change takes root. And that white-knuckle need for control.
It's funny because when you put it like that, it suddenly makes so much sense. Have you ever noticed that when you feel yourself clinging tightly to something, like an idea, a person, a possession, there's almost always this, like, underlying current of fear?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if I let go, then who am I? What will happen?
It's incredibly common. And it all circles back to the ego's desire to protect this very fragile sense of self that it's created. But Watts, he offered a really powerful antidote to this.
Okay. What's that?
Recognizing our interconnectedness.
Okay.
He loved to use this analogy of wave and the ocean.
Okay, I'm really loving these analogies. Keep going. Tell me more about this wave and ocean idea.
All right, so picture a wave, right?
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like this distinct entity, rising and falling.
Mm.
separate from the vastness of the ocean. But is it really separate?
Mm.
Or is it simply a manifestation of the ocean itself,
Yeah.
inseparable from the water that gives it form? And just like that wave, we might perceive ourselves as these individual entities. But in reality,
Yeah.
we're not separate from the world around us.
Mm.
We're part of something so much greater.
That's a really powerful image. So if we buy into this idea that we're all interconnected, that our sense of a separate self, it's all an illusion, then what? How does that change the way we live our lives? How does that help us to let go?
Well, that's where things get really, really interesting. Because if we can even begin to grasp that interconnectedness,
Yeah.
it completely shifts our perspective,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to our attachments.
I am ready to dive deeper into those attachments. This is where I think I start to feel the need for a little letting go in my own life. But let's save that for after we come back. We'll be right back to unpack how this idea of interconnectedness plays out in our daily lives and how it can help us find maybe a little more peace in the chaos. You know, before the break, we were talking about that sense of a separate self.
Right.
The ego, and how that can really make us cling to things, possessions, relationships, even just wanting life to go a certain way.
Yeah.
But if we're all interconnected, like waves in the ocean,
Right.
do those attachments even matter?
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
They matter, and yet they don't. Watts wasn't saying we should all become like emotionless robots,
Right.
indifferent to everything.
Okay.
It's more about understanding the nature of attachment
Okay.
and how it can lead to suffering.
Okay, so how does attachment lead to suffering? Isn't that like a core part of the human experience?
Yeah.
To want things, to strive for them?
It absolutely is. But think about it this way. When we cling too tightly to those desires,
Yeah.
those expectations, we set ourselves up for disappointment,
Right.
even suffering when things don't go according to plan,
Yeah.
which, let's face it, is pretty much inevitable in life.
Tell me about it. I am definitely guilty of clinging to expectations.
Yeah.
And then feeling completely thrown when things go sideways.
Sure.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Watts believed that true freedom comes from accepting that we don't have complete control over everything.
Okay.
It's about holding our desires lightly.
Okay.
Being
Yeah.
attached, yes.
Yeah.
But without that vice-like grip,
Okay.
that creates so much tension in our lives.
So it's less about getting rid of desire and more about changing our relationship to desire.
Yes.
Okay. Instead of, I need this thing to be happy, it's more like, I like this, but it's not the end of the world if it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this wonderful Zen proverb that captures this perfectly.
Okay.
It says, let go or be dragged.
Hmm.
And again, it's not about becoming passive,
Right.
but rather recognizing that resisting the natural flow of life,
Yeah.
that's what ultimately causes us pain.
That reminds me of something that Watts talked about a lot, the importance of living in the present moment.
Yes.
He wasn't a fan of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, was he?
Not at all.
Yeah.
He saw those tendencies, which most of us are guilty of, as huge distractions from the only moment that we truly have any control over.
Which is the present. It's so easy to get caught in that spiral of what ifs and should haves, replaying past mistakes or anxiously anticipating the future. I know I do it all the time.
Yeah.
But how do we actually break free from that cycle? It seems easier said than done.
Well, that's where mindfulness comes in.
Okay.
Watts was a huge advocate for practices like meditation,
Okay.
particularly Zazen,
Okay.
as a way to cultivate that present moment awareness.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried Zazen meditation?
I have to admit, meditation isn't really my forte. My mind tends to race a mile a minute the moment I try to sit still.
Sure.
But I'm open to it.
Yeah.
What exactly is Zazen meditation?
So at its core, it's about simply being present with whatever arises in your experience.
Okay.
Without judgment or resistance.
Okay.
You're not trying to empty your mind, which is a common misconception.
Right.
But rather, becoming aware of your thoughts and feelings as they are.
Okay.
Without getting swept away by them.
Yeah. So it's more about observing that mental chatter.
Yeah.
Without getting caught up in the story.
Exactly. It's a way of training your mind to become more aware of the present moment.
Right.
Which, as Watts pointed out, is really all we ever have.
Right.
It's the only place where life is actually happening.
Yeah, it's like that saying, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift.
Yeah.
That's why it's called the present.
I love that.
But if we're always dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, we miss out on that gift, don't we?
We do. And clinging to those past regrets or future anxieties can make it incredibly difficult to fully embrace the present moment.
Yeah.
Even when it's filled with joy.
Right.
We end up like looking for problems that aren't even there yet.
Yeah.
Or reliving past hurts instead of appreciating the beauty
Right.
right in front of us.
And that fear, that clinging it, even affects how we view something as universal as death, doesn't it? That's a big one when it comes to letting go.
It's the big one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our mortality tends to be the ultimate reminder of our lack of control. And Watts had some really insightful things to say about that.
This is what I find so fascinating about Alan Watts. He tackled these big existential questions head on.
He did.
With such clarity and even humor.
Yes.
So let's talk about death. How did Watts approach something that most people are, like, terrified of?
Well, instead of shying away from it,
Yeah.
he dove right in,
Okay.
urging people to really examine their fear
Okay.
and see it for what it truly was.
Okay.
He believed that much of our fear of death stems from that same illusion of separation we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
The ego's desperate attempt to cling to its existence.
So if we can start to see through that illusion of a separate self,
Right.
does that mean we can also start to loosen the grip of that fear?
That's the idea. Watts drew a lot of inspiration from Eastern traditions,
Okay.
where death is not seen as an ending,
Okay.
but as a transformation, a return to the source.
Okay.
A natural part of this never-ending cycle of life and death.
It's like that beautiful image of the wave returning to the ocean, dissolving back into that vastness that it came from.
Beautiful.
It's not an ending, but emerging a transformation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when we can embrace that perspective,
Yeah.
when we can truly let go of the fear of death, it paradoxically allows us to live more fully
Real.
in the present moment because we're no longer clinging so tightly to life.
There's that paradox again. The idea that by letting go, we actually gain more.
It's true.
This is such a rich conversation.
It is.
And it's really making me think about my own relationship to letting go.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into my personal reflections, I think it's time to start wrapping things up.
Okay.
What do you say we take a moment to really distill the essence of Watts' just let go philosophy? So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We talked about the ego's grip, the illusion of separation, the power of the present moment,
Right.
even facing the fear of death. It's a lot to take in,
It is.
but there's this like beautiful simplicity to it all, isn't there?
Absolutely. I think what's so remarkable about Watts's philosophy is that it's not about like adding more to our already really busy lives.
Right.
It's about stripping away the layers of resistance, the clinging and the striving
Yeah.
to reveal this natural ease and flow
Yeah.
that's always been present.
It's like we're so busy trying to like control the river
Right.
that we forget that we can just float and let the current carry us.
Yeah,
Easier said than done though, right?
it is.
What would you say to someone listening right now who's maybe thinking like, okay, this all sounds great in theory, but how do I actually do this whole letting go thing?
Yeah, it's a lifelong practice, that's for sure.
Right.
But I think Watts would say it begins with awareness.
Okay.
Just start by simply noticing those moments when you're clinging really tightly to something.
Yeah.
An expectation, a fear, a desire.
Yeah.
And don't judge yourself.
Yeah.
Just observe it. And then gently, like releasing a bird from your hand. Practice letting go.
I love that image of releasing a bird. It's so like gentle and freeing. And it makes me think about another important point that we touched on earlier. The idea that letting go doesn't mean giving up.
Exactly. It's not about becoming passive or indifferent.
Right.
It's about showing up fully in each moment,
Yeah.
but without that rigid need to control the outcome. Remember the surfer.
Yeah.
He's not just a passive passenger on the wave.
Right.
He's actively engaged. He's responding to these like forces of nature with skill and with grace.
Yeah.
That's what letting go looks like in action.
So it's more about like choosing your attitude while you're riding the waves life throws your way.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between effort and surrender, between engaging with life fully and trusting that whatever happens, you're going to be okay.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, and I have to say, I'm like feeling inspired to, loosen my grip a little bit, to embrace the ebb and flow a little bit more. What about you?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What's one key takeaway you hope listeners will kind of carry with them from our deep dive into Alan Watts and this art of just letting go?
For me, it always comes back to Watts' emphasis on interconnectedness.
Yeah.
When we can really grasp that we're not these isolated islands,
Yeah.
but that we're all part of something so much vaster and more mysterious than we can even imagine.
Right.
It makes it a little bit easier to let go of that need for constant control.
Right.
There's a really deep sense of peace
Yeah.
that comes from recognizing our place in the grand scheme of things.
I couldn't agree more. And for anyone listening who's feeling inspired to maybe explore these ideas further,
Yeah,
we'll be sure to link to some of Alan Watts's books and talks in the show notes,
great idea.
because we've only just scratched the surface here.
We've only skimmed the surface of this vast and flowing ocean of wisdom.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. Where in your life could you benefit from holding on a little less tightly? What would it feel like to just trust the current a little bit more? Those are questions worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Until next time, happy letting go.